Welcome back to another episode of Let's Build a Graflex. On today's episode, what we're going to be focusing on is installing the battery and speaker as well as the main LED into our G.O.T.H 3D Designs 3D printed chassis. So in order to do that, you're going to need a few things. First off is going to be your battery, still in the box. I got this from soloshold.com. I wore the sticker off because with the sticker on, it goes into the chassis really snug. So I just kind of peeled the sticker off a little bit to get it to fit better. But it will have a sticker. It comes with the J.S.T connector and some rather thick gauge wire. We're going to be modifying this. We're going to be cutting some of it off and soldering some extensions on with some smaller gauge wire so it fits a little better. But you're going to need your battery. You're also going to need your speaker. Now I have two different types here. I have the premium style speaker from the Custom Saber shop. It sounds very nice. It has a nice sleek profile. For how small it is, it really does have a great sound to it. And this is what we're going to be using today. But I also have, just for demonstration purposes, one of the Vico or Veco, I'm not sure how you say it, bass speakers. I got this from the Custom Saber shop as well. As you can tell, this one is a lot thicker. It's a lot wider. It does have a little more sound. It does have more bass to it, bigger magnet, and just better sound quality all the way around. But the reason I prefer this one, the premium speaker, is just for this particular build. The way that the speaker sits, we need to tuck a lot of wire behind it. And if this is your first time building a Saber, it might be a little tricky if you use the bigger one. So we're going to be using this premium speaker, and you'll see what I'm talking about in just a little bit as far as how much space there is behind it. But the speaker is still going to give us a great sound. We're not really sacrificing anything by going with this speaker over the bass speaker. The next thing you're going to need is you're going to need your Allen key. This is a 5/64 for tightening the set screws in the inner core. You're also going to need your inner core all stripped down and modified. If you've been following along with the videos, we have our hole here in the side for our switch, because I'm going to be using a different style switch rather than the red button ones that come with the kit. So I have my hole drilled for that. I have my set screw drilled about a 45-degree angle from the top. That's going to be my chassis retention screw, and I also have my hole drilled for my LED heatsink retention screw. All of these modifications can be viewed in my previous video, which I will leave a link for if you haven't seen it yet. But you're going to want to make sure that this is all modified and ready to go before we get started. You're also going to need some wire. We're going to be using a couple different colors, but I have my wire here. As I've said before, I'm using 30 gauge. Because of the tight spaces of this chassis, 30 gauge is really recommended. You can get away with 28, but it's going to be really tight. So I got this off of eBay. I will leave a description link, in the description box for that as well. You're going to need your electric static discharge safe soldering iron, as well as some solder and your safety glasses, so don't forget those. But other than that, that should be about it. Oh, heat shrink. You're also going to need your heat shrink for when you resolder onto the extensions. As I said before, I just have a variety pack of different sizes and colors here. We're probably just going to be using the small black one, but you're going to need heat shrink for that. So I think that just about does it for the things you're going to need. Maybe a set of helping hands to hold things. Always helpful. That's why they call them helping hands. And some E6000 is what I'm going to be using today to hold the battery and the speaker in place. So without any further ado, let's get started by extending our battery and soldering some wires onto our speaker. Okay, first things first, we're just going to solder our wires onto our speaker. As you can see, the premium speaker has these two pads here that we're going to solder onto, and there's already a little bit of solder on them. They come a little pre-tinned, so we're just going to go ahead and use that rather than pre-tinning it anymore. I have my wire here, and I've chosen blue for the speakers. As I've said before, you can use any color you want to. I've just designated blue as my speaker wire. And if we look real quick at our wiring diagram, we can see that the speaker goes directly back to the speaker pads on the board. They don't go anywhere else, they just go directly to the board. So we know that we don't need a separate color for each lead. It doesn't matter, positive, negative, it doesn't matter if this one goes to this pad or if it goes to the other pad. As long as electricity flows through the speaker itself doesn't really care. So we can use the same color wire. So I've just got my two blues here, and we'll zoom back in on this. Alright, so what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to strip just a piece of sheathing off of the wire. If we lay this across, we can see that'll work out pretty well. You don't want the wire hanging too far over the edge with too much sheathing exposed, or too much of the wire itself exposed, I should say. You want the sheathing butted right up against the solder joint. That'll make it the sturdiest, that'll protect it. And I'm just going to pre-tin this a little bit. I'm just going to take some solder. I'm just going to pre-tin the wire itself, not the pad, because the pad, like I said, is already pre-tinned. I'm just going to touch a little bit on the tip of the soldering iron. Pre-tin this wire. There we go. And we'll zoom back in here. We'll just lay this wire right across. This is one of the other reasons I really like this speaker for this build, is because both of the wire pads are on the top, whereas the bass speaker has them on the sides. And with this chassis, having them on the top really helps out. You can use the bass speaker, that's not a problem. You can use it. It's not unusable for this build. It's just a little easier to do it with this one. And like I said, if you're just starting out, making it a little easier on yourself might be a little beneficial. So now I'm just going to touch this and just solder it to the solder that's already there. Heat it up just for a second. That looks pretty good. You'll notice I didn't add any extra solder because the solder was on the wire, just melted right into the pre-tinned solder on the pad. If I can get my camera to focus. As you can see, that's pretty good. That's nice and solid. That's not going anywhere. I do have a little excess wire hanging off the back. So I'm just going to take my snips. I'm just going to snip that off. There. It's a little cleaner. But that is a very good solder joint. I'm going to put this back in the vise. I'm going to do the same thing for my other blue wire here. Okay, so I've gone ahead and soldered the other pad on, or I should say soldered the other wire onto the pad. So these are both good. What I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm just going to twist these together. I'm going to use my heat gun, using the same technique as I demonstrated in one of my previous videos. I'm going to twist these wires together, and using heat, they won't come apart again. And I twist them to keep them nice and neat, because when you're running them through the chassis, it's just nice to have them nice and neat and tidy, without, you know, all these extra wires flopping all over the place. So let me do that. Okay, so I've gone ahead and twisted all my wires together. I left the ends untwisted because they're going to go to the board individually. I left them long too. I always like to leave my wires longer, so I have too much rather than too little. And as you can see, I also, when I heated them up, I bent them. And I bent them forward towards the speaker. And I did that because when it sits in the chassis, it's going to have to ride forward. And when you heat it up just a little bit and bend it and let it cool, it will stay in this position. So we don't have to worry about it being a fragile joint or anything like that. When you do it when it's nice and warm, it works a little better. So that's it for our speaker for now until we get ready to put it in the chassis. So we can put that aside. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to extend the wires of our battery. In order to do that, what we're going to do first is just get our chassis in hand. We're going to insert this. And what we can do is you have your wires that come out from the battery, from the protection circuit at the top. What you want is you want those wires at the top of the chassis. And as we've talked about before, this hole is at the top, so we just slide our battery in to the chassis, and we can line it up, and we can see that that's the top, and our wires are at the top, so that'll work out well. Slide it all the way in till it stops. Okay. Then just for ha-has, let's grab our inner chassis, have the wire ride in that channel, just like that. Our chassis is going to go together like that. This isn't all the way inserted, it's going to snap in just a little bit further. But we can see that that's about where it's going to go. So we know that this part right here is where our channel is going to be, our wire channel in the inner chassis. So that's where we're going to want our solder joint to go. Because our battery, as you can see, our battery wires are going to come up like this, and they're just going to sit right about like that. So we don't want our solder joint too close to the battery because it's not going to be in a good position to bend over the speaker, because our speaker is going to sit right here. So we want the solder joint to sit right about in the middle of that channel, so right about here, I'd say. Take into account, you know, push that wire up like it's going to sit over the battery. Really kind of position it where it's going to be, and then just kind of mark where you want to cut. So I'm just going to cut it right about there. Just going to pull the wire out. And I'm just going to cut this. Now what I'm going to do when I cut this is I'm going to cut it one at a time. And when I do, I'm going to take a small piece of electrical tape, and I'm going to put it over the wire I just cut. I'm going to fold that over the wire, because what happens is if you cut both of these together, the snips run the risk of cutting through the sheathing on both wires at the same time, and the metal of the snip will actually create a bridge between the two wires, and it will complete the circuit. And if you get a short like that, it will trip the protection circuit in the battery. So just marking where the end of my wire is on this one, line it up. What we might even do is we might stagger these a little bit. I'm actually going to. I'm going to stagger my solder joints so that I don't have the heat shrink and everything right doubled up, which will make it, when you go to put it together, it'll make it a little tighter space. I'm going to stagger the solder joints so that they fit a little nicer together. I'm going to leave this tape on here until I'm all set to go. Until I'm completely done. That's going to stay on there because the JST connector kept the two terminal ends apart. They kept them from touching. So without that on there, we run the risk of always having two wire ends touch. Even though the sheathing is covering them, we still have bare wire on the end. So you want to be careful of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my wire cutter. I'm going to start with, I think, let's try the 24 gauge hole. And that worked pretty well. As you can see, it cut the sheathing without cutting too many of the strands of wire. So that tells me that this wire that comes on the battery is 24 gauge, and that is far too big for this chassis. If you have 24 gauge wire running through this whole thing, it's never going to work. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rest of my wire here. I'm just going to take some black. Just a normal length of black. You can cut it as long as you want, long enough to go back to the battery. I'm just going to cut that. Now we have my black wire, and as you can see the difference in wire sizes. My camera will focus. There we go. This, as I said, is about 24 gauge, judging by the hole that I used in my snipper. And this is 30 gauge, which we've been using throughout the whole build. You can just see the difference in size. If we used this throughout the whole thing, you'd never be able to get this through the chassis. That's why I recommend the 30 gauge. It's so small, it just gets in the tighter spaces a lot easier. So I'm just going to strip about the same amount of wire, same amount of sheathing that I just did off of the wire coming off of the battery. As you can see, my camera will focus. There we go. As you can see, they're about the same length, so that'll work out really well. I'm going to get my helping hands. Put one end in there. Lay this down a little bit, that way I don't have as much stress on the wire. Put my helping hand. Clamp that in there. That's nice and tight. Now again, I use these little alligator clips, the copper ones, inside the jaws of the helping hands because these jaws are smooth and they don't damage the wire. They still hold it just fine. If I can get it in the jaw, there we go. They do a fine job of holding it steady, but it doesn't damage the wire as much as the regular jaws do. The teeth on the regular jaws really do a number on the wire. So let me clean the tip of my soldering iron, pre-tin the tip of my iron. I'm going to pre-tin the tip of the wire, both wires. I'm going to lay one over the other. Now there are many ways you can solder two wires together. You can twist them, you can intertwine the strands. A lot of people have their own opinions on which way is better, which way is stronger. For something like this, I usually just lay it over and it usually works out just fine. Just apply a little solder. As you can see, that's a fine joint. It's nice and sturdy. It's not a cold solder joint. I'm applying a decent amount of pressure. It's not coming apart. We're going to call that good. So now I'm going to take, before I forget, I'm going to take my little piece of black heat shrink. I'm going to measure this joint. Cut enough heat shrink so that it covers the whole joint and then some, because it's going to add some rigidity to the wire. It's going to protect it a little bit, so you don't want to cover just the point that you soldered. You want it to cover a little ways beyond that. So we can see that's nice and shrunk up, nice and sturdy. I like that a lot. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take another piece of electrical tape. I'm just going to cut off another small piece. And this time I'm going to cover my black wire. I'm going to do that because I'm about to uncover my red wire. And like I said, I always want one protected. So you can just pull this off. And we're going to do the same thing as before. Okay, so I have both of my wires extended, and as you can see, like I said, I staggered the solder joints, so now when they ride together, you can put them together just like this. they sit a lot closer together because the solder joint and the heat shrink add to the diameter of the wire. So if you put them right next to each other, it's really going to space out the wire more than we want to. We want to keep everything as tight as possible. So I staggered them so that it's always the same thickness no matter what. It's just a little trick you can do. You don't have to do it, but it's just something I like to do. Okay, now that we have our battery wires extended and we have our speaker wires soldered on, what we can begin to do is assemble our saber. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our main outer shell of our chassis. We're actually going to take our LED, which we wired up in the one of the previous videos with our resistors in place and everything. We have all these wires going back to 3 wires now. One red wire for the power to all 3 of them. We have the green negative to the main blue LEDs, and we have the purple negative to the white flash on clash. As we can see, our LED heatsink is going to butt right up against the chassis. And we have our wires in there like that. Now, it's difficult to see on camera, but there is a wire channel in the top. As you can see, there is a step inside right here. This whole area here is where the wires are going to ride on top of the battery. As you can see, there's a step that my screwdriver drops down into. So you want to make sure that your wires always stay in that. So what we can do now is we can take our battery that we just extended the wires on, align the top with the wires, slide the battery in, and making sure that the wire from the LED stay in that channel. It's hard to get this on camera and still have you be able to see it. There. Our wires are in the channel. They're not moving. We can still move our LED. The wires are nice and loose. We can slide in our chassis. It may be a little snug. As you can see, my battery is twisted a little bit, so I'm just going to spin it. And it slides all the way in. And we can still pull our LED, which means that none of our LED wires are caught or pulled too tight or anything like that. We can still pull those out. And we have plenty of slack. So now, with the battery installed, what you can do is you can take your modified inner core. As we said before, this wire channel here is for the top, or I should say it is the top. It's for if you're using the red button switch, this is where the wires would come down, and I described that in my previous video as well, that if you are using your normal red top button that comes with the Graflex 2.0 kit, you're going to need to modify this chassis even more. You're going to need to dig out some channels here and drill another hole for your red switch wire. As I'm using the Graflex clamp switch holder that I purchased separately, I'm going to be using this separate hole that I drilled here, but if you are using the red ones, you are going to need to modify the chassis a little more. That being said, I can now insert my LED and my chassis into the inner core, orienting the top hole with the top of the saber. I can slide that all the way in until it stops. You can push down to push the LED against the chassis. What I'm actually going to do, I'm actually going to stand this on end. I'm going to push down, if you can see this. I'm going to push down on the LED and keeping pressure on the LED so it doesn't move. Let's see if I can get this to focus a little better. I don't think it wants to focus. There we go. But the moment I move my hand, it's going to unfocus. So what we can do is we can take our set screw here. I have my tiny little 1/8 by 8 32 set screw. I'm just going to put it in the end of my 5/16 Allen key, just like that. I'm just going to thread this in. Again, keeping pressure on the top of the LED to keep pressure, to keep it pushed down so it doesn't slide up too far. I'm just going to tighten this down. It doesn't take much because the threads on this hole are so short. It doesn't take much before it stops. And that's about it. My LED is now locked in place inside my inner core. So now what we can do, let me reposition this again, is we have our inner core, and if you pull, you can see the LED wires will ride nice and free on top of the battery, but our LED is locked in place. So what we can do now is we can actually lock in place our chassis itself. Again, if you orientate the channel with the hole in the top of the chassis, line that up, slide your chassis all the way in. You can also use the side window here, this little hole we cut for the switch wire to ride in. You can see, there's our chassis, there's the hole, there's our chassis again at the bottom, top. So you want to make sure that you have that hole there lined up for our switch wires to go through. But we can just eyeball it too. You just line up this top window with our the top of the inner core. That looks pretty well lined up. And now I already have my chassis set screw inserted, so I'm just going to tighten that down. And that is going to put pressure on the battery, on the chassis, but it's also going to push against the battery, which you want to double check at this point. Let me get my light so you can see. And make sure your battery is fully inserted. You don't want it hanging out at all. You want to make sure it's fully inserted, which mine is. And you can just tighten this set screw down. Just like that. Now our chassis is firmly locked in place. My LED is firmly locked in place, and it also puts enough tension on the battery, and my battery is also locked in place. So we don't need to glue the battery in place. The set screw does a fine job of keeping that in all on its own. Okay, a little note. I mentioned in the previous video when we were modifying the inner core, I put the chassis retention screw at the 45-degree angle because if you put it directly at the top, it's going to pinch the wires. It's going to make it very difficult for these wires to move. They're certainly not going to be able to move as freely as they do now, and it's just not going to work very well. So I went ahead and put it at a 45. It still catches the flat part of the chassis. It just allows these wires to move, and it's going to make it very easy to insert our switch wire, which we will do in just a moment. Okay, so now we have all of our wires from our battery and our LED running out this side hole here. We have our chassis retention screw and our heatsink retention screw locked in place. The next thing we're going to want to do is insert our switch wire. I have my switch here that I soldered together in the previous video. I've got my wires all twisted together. Again, extra long. I left the ends untwisted. If you are using the red button switch, you would have installed your red button wire already. You would have ran that down and ran it through and had it coming out, and then you would have run it through when you installed your LED. You would have left that really long and then just slid it all together, and then when you inserted the chassis, you would have slid it together then. But since we're using this style switch for the Graflex clamp, we can go ahead and install that now that we have our chassis and everything in place. So let me zoom in a little bit here, make it easier for you to see. Okay, now the reason that we're doing it now is because we have to have everything in place before we slide this wire through. You can't slide it through and have it coming out and then try and slide the chassis in place because the chassis will pinch the wire and it'll cut it up. So we have to do it once the chassis is already locked in place. Now this can be a little frustrating at first, but what you're going to want to do is take your wire, and what I do is I bend just the end of it. Just put a slight bend and then angle the wire position the wire going towards the way that it's bent. So I have mine bent like this, and I'm going to angle that going back because that's where I want the wire to go. And I'm going to insert it here into our switch wire hole, and it will ride in the channel in the chassis, and it'll get to the point where it meets up with the LED wires, and hopefully it will bend and it'll come out up here. Now this may take a few tries of fiddling with it before it finally goes. As you can see, now it's bent, and it hit the wires and it went the opposite way that I wanted it to. I'm just going to rebend these, and like I said, this may take a few tries. This may be very frustrating. I've tried this a number of different ways, and this is the easiest way that I found to do it. And as we can see, now that just happened to go just right, and we have our wire sticking out the top. Unfortunately, we only have, looks like one wire. Nope, my brown wire is there also. It just needs a little help coming the rest of the way out. Okay, I have loosened my retention screw on my chassis a little bit, and spun my battery. My battery wasn't quite lined up the way I wanted it, but I spun the battery and I managed to get my brown and black switch wires to go through. So now we can just pull and push, push and pull. You may get caught a little bit because they're twisted. The twist sometimes catches, but you can get it. There we go. Just pull that right through and just leave a little bit. Leave the switch hanging out just a little bit. You don't need to pull it all the way tight. You want enough for it to sit in the clamp and move in position, because it will ride something like this. It's not going to sit right over the hole. It's going to sit a little far forward. So just give yourself a little bit of slack. And you can just route that right out the other hole with all the rest of them. And as I said, I had loosened my retention screw from my chassis, so I'm just going to line this back up. Now that I have all these wires out and routed, I'm just going to tighten the screw down. So we now have our switch wire hanging through. We have all of our switch wires back here. We have our main LED wires, and we have our battery positive and negative. And we're starting to get quite the jumble of wires here, but if you color coded everything and you're using your wiring diagram, you should know exactly what everything is and where everything is going to go. So now we can insert our speaker. Okay, inserting the battery can be a little tricky and a little tedious, but not too bad. What you're going to want is you're going to need your speaker. And as I said, I bent my wires and twisted them all together so they sit where I want them to go. I'm also going to use my E6000. You can use super glue or some sort of contact cement or putty, something like that. And I'm going to be using just a toothpick as an applicator for the E6000. But the first thing you're going to want to do is, I have all my wires coming out this side hole here, the crystal reveal of the chassis. So what you're going to want to do is route all of your wires. You can do it one at a time. Let's start with the battery wires, why not? And you're just going to want to route them right out the back. Okay, so now we have all this wire, all this mess of wire routed out the back, and as you can see, we have this window here where all this wire is going to sit. But with all this routed out the back, what we can do is, just the whole time you're doing this, you're going to want to keep pressure. Just keep the wires to the top, press to the top of the chassis as you insert the speaker, just to make things a little easier on yourself. I'm not sure if you can see. It's very difficult without the proper lighting. We have this ring, as you can see, right here, all the way around, or not all the way around, but most of the way. That's what our speaker is going to rest against. Our speaker is going to rest right on it, and it's on that side. We also have some little pieces of it on this side here, and that's what our speaker is going to rest against. You can see it kind of all the way around. There's a little tab there, there's a little tab there, and we have the main ring on the back side. So that's what our speaker is going to sit against, and this edge is going to sit right against that ring. So what we can do, we can see that the ring is mainly on the bottom, a little bit on the top, but mainly on the bottom. So that's really where we're going to want to concentrate our glue or whatever you are using. So I'm just going to take a little bit on my toothpick. Now E6000 is very stringy, so make sure you break all the strings off. So now we're just going to take this and I'm just going to apply it to the whole bottom of the speaker, just like that, right in that lip, right in that groove. And then when we insert the speaker, it will squeeze out and it'll cover a whole bunch of other areas. I'm going to get the outside lip a little bit too. I'm going to put a little bit on the top as well, because we do have a few little places for it to adhere to. Now you notice that the more you work with E6000, the tackier it gets. It gets to be pretty tacky. It's not really a liquid. So you just kind of gotta get used to it a little bit. Work kind of quickly, because it will start to solidify fairly quickly, and it just becomes kind of more of a pain to work with once it does. So I'm going to call that pretty good. What I'm going to do, I'm going to drop my speaker using the wires. I'm going to drop the speaker down. Keep in mind where the top is, because you want the bend of the wires at the top. I'm going to drop this down in. I'm going to keep all my wiring, as I said, to the top, out of the way. I'm going to drop the speaker down in. And as you can see, or not see, I'm just using my little screwdriver here, pick the back end up. You can see I'm pressing right against those wires. I'm just going to press, keep everything in this window, make sure all the wires are lined up. Now the problem is, I'm not sure if you can see it, the speaker is sitting below that ring. We don't want it to sit below the ring, we want it to sit right on the ring. So just kind of lift up the back end, move my wires again so that everything rides in this window here, and then just like that. So now we can just kind of rearrange these wires so they're a little neater, nice and even, nothing resting on top of another one. You don't want anything to be pinched or caught or anything like that. You still want all your wires to be able to move nice and freely. And then push the speaker down into place all the way around. Nice even pressure, get it to really sit against that ring. Don't press on the middle of the speaker, you don't want to damage the speaker. Make sure to use kind of like your fingernail right on the very edge, the metal edge of the speaker. And again, try and concentrate most of the pressure on the bottom side, because that's where the lip is and that's where the glue will hold the best. So what we can do, if you want to really make sure you have a good hold, we can take just a little more of the glue and just apply it to that mating edge all the way around. You don't need to use an excessive amount, because when the chassis is fully assembled and fully inserted, the inner chassis does put a lot of pressure on the speaker. Okay, our speaker is now fully installed. I put just a small amount of glue around the outer edge. You really, like I said, the glue isn't ultimately necessary. I do it just as a precaution, just to keep things just a little more stable. But when you insert the inner chassis, the bottom of the inner chassis presses right against the speaker and pushes it against that lip. You don't have to use any glue to keep the speaker in place. As I said, I do it just as a precaution. I just like to make sure things are a little more secure, that it's not going to rattle around. That's why I use the E6000, because it is pretty flexible. I think it works pretty well. But if you don't want to use any, and if somebody tells you, oh, you don't have to glue it in, you know, they're right. You know, it's not a mandatory thing. It's just a precaution. So with our speaker now in place, as you can see, we have all of our wires up top. You're going to want to make sure that these are still flexible. You can still move these, because we are going to have to pull them up through this hole after we solder on to the soundboard, and we're going to tuck all that excess kind of down behind the speaker, and tuck it out of the way. But that's for a different day, different video. As of right now, for the battery and the speaker installation, we are all set. So thank you for watching another episode of Let's Build a Graflex. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we concentrate on the recharge port. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be soldering onto the recharge port. We're going to install it into our crystal chamber part of our chassis. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to demonstrate how you can test your recharge port to figure out which prong is which, since there's 3 of them. And we're going to solder our battery to the recharge port, and we're also going to solder our wires that go from the recharge port to the soundboard. So stay tuned for the next episode of Let's Build a Graflex. Thanks for watching.